what the West did to Eastern martial arts is turn them into sports, because that's what we're good at. And figure out
from an art into a sport.
Yeah, or a cultural product, and a spiritual product. So what's interesting about traditional martial arts is they had several aspects to them. You know, there's a healing aspect. For example, like Tai Chi was considered a way to kind of keep your health and longevity, which is why you would see a lot of older Chinese people practice that. And then obviously there was a fighting aspect, but it was not for sport. It was, you know, traditionally for warfare. And there's a spiritual aspect. What I would tell people is Kung Fu is a form of moving meditation. That the idea was you do these moves over and over again until you get into a state of kind of higher consciousness. And when you get to MMA in Las Vegas, it's just about the bling and the money and the winning, right? That's what they care about. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. The good thing about it is they get really good because, you know, when a young man's motivated by bling and money and groupies and fame, he's highly motivated. So that's the big difference between the two. You know, one is purely for sport. It's commercial. It's about success. It's all winning and losing. And the other one has that to it as well. They're not free of the selfishness of the West. There's not a noble side and an ignoble side. But there are other aspects that were important to the development of martial arts and were considered when you were training. So there was an idea that this is some sort of spiritual practice when you were at the Shaolin Temple. And there's nothing spiritual about MMA. MMA fighting is closer to what an actual fight is like than Kung Fu is. The problem the traditional martial arts had was they accumulated a lot of kind of historical tradition. And so a lot of the techniques that were taught in traditional martial arts are not that effective in a street fight. But you did it because your master did it, because his master did it, because his master did it. So I think one of the problems with traditional martial arts was essentially they were too conservative and they were too tradition-based. And one of the innovations of MMA was to make it very American in that pragmatic sense, like what works, works, and what doesn't, we get rid of. And because the sport itself has as few rules as you can have, basically without people dying, it allowed it to be as close as you could get to a street fighting circumstance. And so what's interesting is if you go watch UFC 1 through 5, the guys have no idea what they're doing. Like, those are my favorite UFCs to watch, the first 4 or 5 years, because they don't know what they're doing. Like, they're still figuring it out. They don't know what technique will work. They come in with some of their some guy comes in with some traditional karate and gets crushed, or, you know, some jiu-jitsu guy wins a couple and he thinks he's great, and then he gets punched in the face and he's not used to that. So, the pragmatic aspect of essentially the cage being like a petri dish where you're engaging in repeated experiments to see what works, has allowed it to advance. So now they all sort of fight the same and they've all figured out what kind of works, but they didn't know before. And so we essentially had like a 30-year, 25-year experiment on what's effective. Now, there are aspects of a real fight that are nothing like being in a cage. The number one difference is, having been in a few bar fights myself, I can tell you that it never stays one-on-one. Like, when you're in a cage, you fight one guy. And when you're in a bar, his 3 friends jump you from behind. And then some random dude who just wants to get in the fight jumps in there too. And pretty soon there's 5 guys you're fighting, and you thought you were just fighting one. So the techniques you use against one person are very different than the techniques you use against 5. For example, in the cage, oftentimes you'll take somebody to the ground, right? You try to tackle them, throw them down to the ground, get on top, mount, or get on the bottom or whatever. An excellent technique against one person. A really terrible technique when you're in a cowboy bar and there's 5 guys with boots kicking at you because you've just put yourself at boot kicking level. So that's, just one example, but it's the most important one. And then, of course, the second issue is there's no weapons. And if you're in a real street fight, at some point somebody picks up a bottle, or a bar fight, and tries to bash you over the head with it. Or they got a knife on them. You don't want to be grappling on the ground with somebody who's pulls a knife out of his side, out of his belt. So there's a lot of techniques that, work because it's one-on-one, it's in a contained space. The floor is matted. It's not covered in broken glass like in a bar fight. So there's a lot of things that are different. So if you were in a real street fight, you would almost certainly want to stay on your feet and not go down if you could avoid it. And then a MMA fight, going down is very useful.